Welcome to the Listen Up podcast, where we explore hearing loss, communication, connections, and health.
Hey everybody, Dr. Mark Sims here. I'm the host of the Listen Up podcast, where I feature top leaders in healthcare. This episode is brought to you by Listen Up Hearing Centers. I help patients to effectively treat their hearing loss so that they can connect better with their friends and family and remain independent. The reason I'm so passionate about hearing loss is because I lost my brother Robbie twice. First, to hearing loss from radiation to his brain tumor, and then when he passed away. I only care for ears. I'm the E of ENT. I've performed over 10,000 ear surgeries and taken care of many more with hearing loss over the past 20 years. I'm the founder of Listen Up Hearing Center, and I've also written a book called Listen Up, a physician's guide to effectively treating your hearing loss. If you want to learn more about that, go to listenuphearing.com. Today, we have a great guest. It's Reese Jones. He's a practice trainer at AuDExperts, right?
AuDExperts, yep.
Yeah, my bad. AuDExperts. Yep. So it's written. That's why he spends his time working with practices around the country, training their staff to better help patients. He believes in understanding a patient's why before moving them forward with medical correction and treatment. He helps practices build strong TCEPs using the Kolbe concepts, something we've heard before. He's traveled across the country aiding hearing healthcare practice owners and creating medical and authoritative systems to help treat people with untreated hearing loss, while helping employees of those practices find their right seat on the bus within the organization. This is great stuff. Reese, thanks so much for coming on. I'm excited to talk to you about this.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Sims. I appreciate you inviting me on your podcast.
Sure, please call me Mark. So it's just,
Mark.
Yep. Yeah. So Reese, I believe your colleague referenced that you're an ultra marathoner.
Yeah.
Right. And so do you do rim to rims on the Grand Canyon and the like?
Yep, I'm a big runner. I think they're very parallel to having patient conversations in some weird sense, though. I've been running for a couple of years, and I do what we call ultra marathons, which is anything above the traditional 26.2. So what you're referring to is I just went to the Grand Canyon maybe a month ago. We started on the North Rim, went to the South Rim and back in one day, which is like 50 miles, 10,000 feet of elevation gain.
Yeah, so I've done a rim to rim. We called that rim to crazy.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Quite an undertaking. What time did you set off in the morning?
We probably woke up around 2 because we were an hour drive out, started roughly around 4. And then I was leaving the Grand Canyon at 7 p.m. that night.
So for listeners, that's done with headlamps. And we have to do it on kind of the tails of the season, either spring after the thaw or fall before snow, because it's the temperatures are not very pleasant for doing that in midsummer. So
yeah, it's either super hot or super cold, and we caught it right before the winter. Right as we were leaving, it was snowing. So we got the last day.
Yeah, many people do these rim to rims right before the north rim of the canyon closes, and so there's not a lot of access there, but it is a beautiful part of the country. And so that's so how long have you been doing ultra marathoning?
I probably, let's see, in 2020, right before the pandemic and COVID and everything, I ran a half marathon because my mom thought, she was like, why don't you just go and try it? And so I had ran in high school, but it was with a girl I was dating at the time. And once we broke up, I just didn't, continue. And then so a couple of years later in 2020, my mom was like, there's a half marathon on Saturday, and it was Wednesday. I was like, all right, let's see what happens, right? No training. I went and ran a decent time and was like, well, what could I do if I put more effort in training and whatnot? So that was January of 2020. And then I signed up like the next day for a 100-mile race in September. So I'm an extremist. I went straight from like 13.1 miles to let's see if I can do 100, right?
Wow.
And so it sounds funny when I say it out loud, but I only did 66 of the miles that September, just because I didn't complete it, but that's how far I made it. And then, so really it kicked off towards the end of 2020, and I've been running 100 milers, 50 milers, Grand Canyon since then. So a couple of years now.
Well, good for you. So it's a recent bug that you've got.
Yeah, it's a recent bug. I've always been athletic. I wrestled in high school. I played all the sports I could when I was, in elementary. I really got drawn to running, like wrestling, because it's on me. When I would do sports or have, I was always the smallest or shortest, and I was born right before the cutoff. So I was always younger in my grade in my classes. And with wrestling, there was weight classes, but even then, I was always the hardest worker. I would get that compliment from a lot of my coaches. but I was smaller and weaker. And so I liked wrestling and then running, because if I didn't hit my time or win, that was on me. It wasn't because I threw a pass and someone dropped it or someone, intercepted. The responsibility's on me.
Right. So your performance is directly related to your own effort. And
Yeah,
that's great.
completely.
So tell me how you ended up, coaching in the hearing space.
Yeah, it's a great, I think what I refer to like a little untraditional, a little unconventional approach, and I didn't really have anyone that I knew of that had hearing loss. I now know, like my dad, he has tinnitus, he was in the military, and a little bit of hearing loss. So like getting into the industry, I wasn't necessarily initially attracted because of hearing loss.
Mhm.
About, I think it was 2017, I got a speeding ticket while I was going to school, and I was like, I need a job to pay off this ticket, right? So shouldn't have been speeding. It is what it is. So I started working at, it was May of 2017. I started working at Intermountain Audiology, which is here in St. George, Utah, where I'm at. And Morgan, he interviewed in the past and kind of set this up for me. He was the director of operations at the time. And so I went in, I was like, I need part-time work. What can I do? And so basically I just, after school, would go and run and get coffees, paint the dings on the walls, trash, like nothing grand, but it was important stuff that needed to be done right. It took it off of their plate and the people there. And so what would happen is I was going to school in the morning, and I was kind of, I wouldn't say I was obnoxious, but I was the guy that was like, why are we learning about imaginary numbers? Like, what is that going to do for me? Right. And so I was just like going to school, not entertained, because I was like, how is this applicable to life? And then I
Sure.
would go in the afternoon and start having conversations on the side with patients of people who obviously couldn't connect with their family or their grandkids or whoever. And it was so eye-opening because, like I said, I had no idea this was that big of an issue. I didn't have any family that, even if they had hearing loss, it wasn't like as dramatic as it can be. And so I was having conversations and seeing, there's an estimated 42 million people with untreated hearing loss. And so I was learning stuff that I didn't think was appropriate, or like it didn't get me excited
It wasn't
versus
impactful. How's
it
that
wasn't
right?
impactful. Exactly. And that's the key word, is I was like, I'm not making as much of an impact learning math, and it's all important stuff. It's nothing against the knowledge. But when I saw 42 million people that need help re-engaging with their families, I was turned on. And so I was like, I stopped going to school, talked with Morgan, and was able to get full-time work and working at the front desk and phones. And so to kind of wrap that up, you asked me how I got into coaching and training. We had an interesting model as I got better at talking with patients, because like I sat at the front desk and then I started doing outbound calls and then having financial conversations. I don't have an HIS or any, like, I'm not a provider. What we would do is patients would come in, I'd meet with them for about 30, 40 minutes, talk about financials, what treatment would look like, and then pass them on to the doctor for evaluation and fitting. And what that does is it freed up the doctor's time. So instead of treating 4 patients in a day, we could treat 8, because I was taking up some of that slot. And
Sure.
so there came a point where I was getting, like, my conversion rate was like 70 to 90% in these conversations. And I came to this like point of, there's 42 million people with untreated hearing loss. I can help 6 a day. I'm not going to get through them all. And so I had a conversation with my boss, Jared, and he has this consulting company, AuDExperts, where we train and help people treat more patients. And so I said, if I could step out and help people do what I was able to do, we're going to get through that number at a much faster rate, obviously.
No, that's great. And so, a kind of a happenstance into a passion.
Oh, completely, completely. It was like, here's one of the things I was telling myself, especially several years ago. It's like, as you're younger, like, what do I do with my life? What's the impact I'm going to have? And I couldn't see what was going to happen, but I read this book that's called As a Man Thinketh. It's very short. It's a really awesome read. And there's this phrase in there where it talks about, if you don't know what you're supposed to do what you're currently doing to the best of your ability. For example, if you're a garbage man and you're not necessarily inspired by it, but if you do as best as you can, you may one day have the knowledge and grow $1 billion garbage empire, right? And so I was like, how can I be the best at having patient conversations? And it developed into like something I'm incredibly grateful for, and would not have been able to tell you 3, 4, 5 years ago was going to happen.
So what's your approach to patients? It's either your approach or your coaching approach. It's kind of the same, it sounds like. You're either guiding people to you could correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're guiding people to use the framework of the way you have conversations yourself, right? And so the conversations you have in and of themselves are kind of what you train. So if a patient says that they don't really think they have hearing loss, what type of approach do you take to a patient who says, I don't really think I have a hearing loss?
Yeah, that's great. And one of the first things before I even talk about what I would specifically say is what I found is the breakdown with a lot of the people I work with, whether it's listening to phone calls or recordings of appointments or whatever it might be, is they don't even acknowledge something like that right up front. And that's one of the biggest issues. Like if you think it's a crude comparison, but if you go to like cars, right, or the slimy car salesperson, that's what we refer to when we talk about sales. And people don't like that because that person's pushy or assumes. For example, when I went in to get a car, I said, I want a Camry 2020. This is what I want. And the guy said, great, let's go look at other cars. So it didn't even acknowledge the thing I wanted. And I ended up going somewhere else, right? Because I wasn't heard. So with patients, what's happening is I think we have to understand that they don't obviously get audiology like us professionals do. And so when they say, I don't think I have a hearing loss, one, they have some walls up because they're afraid of being sold. But two, they might actually, like, hearing loss is so gradual. They really, if it was night and day difference from today versus 20 years ago, they would have noticed it, but it's so gradual, like eyesight, right? And so the first thing I want to say as a concept before even talking about what to say is acknowledge that. Like, let a patient feel heard, because if you just breeze over that, what a lot of providers do will be like, yeah, well, most patients I see here have a hearing loss. If you're in your 60s, you probably have one. And they totally dismiss what the patient said. Opposed to, I appreciate you sharing that and where you're at this moment. And that's why we have the evaluation we'll get into. Can we talk a little bit about why you want to be here today? So that acknowledgement, which isn't an agreement, that's the other thing. It doesn't mean you're agreeing with them. It just means you're meeting them where they're at.
Okay. And so what if so you get to that point. What if they still tell you, well, I don't think I have a hearing loss?
Great. Yeah, exactly. If we get to that point and they don't have a hearing loss, I'd say awesome. And if that's why we're going to do the evaluation. Let's say you do have a hearing loss after the evaluation. What are your thoughts about treating that hearing loss if we have it? Okay. And then it's a hypothetical, because at that point, the pressure's off, and then they'll say, not interested. And then I know how committed they are. But what I usually find in that conversation is, well, if I need it, sure, but what does that look like? And then we've opened up the conversation opposed to, I'm just here for a hearing test. So another concept, hypotheticals are incredible because they kind of paint the picture of what could be, even if a patient doesn't believe that's what in its current state.
So what do you think are some of the resistances that patients have to this concept? I mean, I agree with you. There are people who they don't want to acknowledge that they have a hearing loss because they kind of know the logical progression.
Yeah.
In other words, they know that they know the punchline. Right? And so, but there are others, what other type of objections do you think they have?
Yeah. So there's a couple of big ones I teach in some of my training programs. And I kind of touched on one of the first ones, which is they're afraid of being sold. Like, I think this isn't just audiology. This is in general. People don't like sales today versus like the consumer in markets today versus decades ago is completely different.
Right. They're
super well educated. They have a ton of information on Google that may not even be accurate to begin with, but they've done a ton of research and they've come to their conceived notions. Where in the past, again, to go to cars, you weren't able to Google what the different prices were compared to dealerships. You had to physically go, and maybe the car salesperson closed you while you're there. And so the same thing today is like with audiology, patients are afraid of being sold for a couple of reasons, I think, is they're getting so much conflicting information. I think that's the first thing, is they go onto Google and it says, buy these over-the-counter devices or get these Bose hearing aids or AirPods can help you hear better. And then they go into a practice and they say, we need $7,000 to help you hear better. And that's a huge jump because they don't know the difference. And so the first thing is they're afraid of being sold. And so that's when I hear a patient say something like, I don't think I have a hearing loss. To me, that doesn't make sense, because then why would, I don't just go get a colonoscopy.
Why would you get the advice? I say that all the time. Why did somebody kidnap you and bring you here to get a hearing test? If you don't think you have hearing loss, why would you come? Right?
It doesn't make sense, right? Just like I just don't randomly go get colonoscopies or a heart check because there's no concern for me there. And so I know immediately that 99% of the time they probably have a hearing loss. I look at that patient and say, wow, they're afraid of being sold. So I got to spend plenty of time building rapport, not even talking about treatment, to open them up before we even have that conversation. So that's the first thing, is afraid of being sold. The other one is patients know the diagnosis, but they don't know the risks. And what I mean by that is, again, these patients know there's an issue or else they wouldn't have really shown up. They don't know the risks of not doing something. We're seeing with a lot of the research of increased risk of cognitive decline and dementia, increased risk of falls. I mean, all this stuff that is starting to be more and more prominent. It's been around for a while, but it's just the conversation.
Mainstream.
It's more mainstream. When a patient says, my hearing loss is not that bad, I'm fine, I'll get by, a 500% increased risk of dementia is not fine. You're not getting by with that. It's just they don't understand the consequences. Just like what do we do when someone finds out they have stage 4 cancer? What do they think? I could potentially die. Like, it's extreme, but they know the risks of untreated cancer. Our patients today don't know the risks of untreated hearing loss. They just think I have to ask people to repeat themselves, and I'm fine with that. They don't realize they're 140% more likely to fall with every degree of hearing loss. They don't realize they're at a 200 to 500% increased risk of developing dementia. I mean, there's so many things that they're just not aware of, like we are with other medical disorders and issues like strokes and heart conditions and cancer.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's great stuff. Yeah. And so the way you were doing it, you were talking to them before they had their evaluation, correct?
Yeah. So that's what's really interesting about what I was doing is I was talking to patients before the results were out, because we knew they were coming in because they knew they had an issue. And so what I was doing a lot of was protecting the doctor's time, because if that patient really wasn't committed, we would end up like sending them out or sending them with some homework and coming back and having the test after they agreed to treatment, which is completely it's not a lot of people do that in this field. And it was because of two things: or pre-education on the phone and the books we would send out in the symposiums, and then two, asking the right questions to get patients to admit to a problem before the test. Because once they've admitted to a problem, we can talk about solutions before the evaluation.
That's interesting, because there's a lot of surveys, right? And so do you do a particular survey?
Meaning?
Well, there's like the Hearing Health Handicap Index, and there's a bunch of different surveys, or are there particular questions you're trying to get them to acknowledge? Like increase volume on the TV, asking people to repeat themselves. What are the things that you're trying to get them to acknowledge?
Yeah. And that's the key thing there, is what you're saying is getting them to acknowledge. So for you and me, or people in hearing healthcare, we know typically what patients deal with, their symptoms. That's what I'm trying to get them to admit to, is their symptoms. Background noise, they can't filter out that noise. It gets in the way of things. Clarity of speech. So if someone has a mask on or isn't facing them, it's not clear. They hear noise, but it's not clear to them. And then actually tinnitus as well. And so I'd be asking questions based off of knowing that's their symptoms, but not because I need them to tell me. I know if you have a hearing loss, you have an issue with background noise. I could jump to that conclusion, but it's them admitting it out loud to themselves. So then they realize they have to do something.
So interesting process. So if they don't acknowledge it, you would then give them homework, right?
Yeah, exactly. Whether it's read the book or maybe even go I'm getting kind of ahead of myself, but if someone says, I think I can go get it cheaper, so, that's totally fine if that's the route you want to go. Like, we talk about it, but if we were truly there and they were like, I'm just going to look at some, I was getting them to talk about this all before the evaluation.
Right. No,
I feel great. If you want to go somewhere cheaper, great, awesome. They go, and then they come back later and be like, wow, you guys are completely different.
Right.
I had this one patient in particular. This is what happened. I remember he came in, we were having this conversation. It was going fine. He brought up Costco. His brother loved his Costco hearing aids or whatever. And then I said, you know what, if that's where we're at, we talked 30 minutes. I was like, you might as well just go to Costco, because we're not Costco, if that's what you're looking for. He went to Costco. 2 years later, he came back and said, Reese, I remember talking to you. You were right. And so it was unfortunate that he had to go through that and spend that money. But I also have to protect my doctor's time, because there's 42 million people with untreated hearing loss. And if you're not quite there yet, we'll try and give you what you need, but sometimes you kind of have to get burned in some sense, which again, it hurts me, but I had a doctor to protect.
No, actually it's funny, because you remind me, I had a patient who had Costco hearing aids for 15 years, and then we fitted him, and he's like, wow, that's all that stuff I haven't been hearing. So, I mean, and it's not just a knock, that's not totally fair, but I mean, I'm not trying to knock a particular provider, because there are people good at all of these places.
Agreed.
But it's a different experience. And so,
it is.
That's really fascinating. So you'd send them either somewhere else or have them do some homework, and the homework was read the book, and then you'd have them come back if they still wanted to, right?
Yeah. So Dr. Darrow, I'm sure you've heard his name, Dr. Keith Darrow. He has a book. He has a couple now, but the book that when I was in the practice, we would give patients Stop Living in Isolation is what his book title is called. He has a new one, Preventing Decline. And we would try and get that to them before they would come in. So if we booked them 2 weeks out, they get in the mail. But if they came in, hadn't read the book, weren't quite ready, I'd say, you know what? So we don't waste your time. You don't waste ours. I'd say that in a much more polite way, but go find some more information. Because again, one of the reasons why patients don't start is they don't know the risks. And so that book talks about it. And it's hard to have that whole conversation in 30 or 40 minutes. And so oftentimes it would be go read the book and then come back. And some wouldn't. But then again, it wasn't a bunch of hours put into someone who wasn't going to work with us from a private, practice perspective. We need revenue coming in, right? And so we can't spend all this time on people who aren't willing to pay for service and technology.
That's fascinating. So when you're doing this and developing this, I mean, obviously this is the same stuff you coach other people. How did you close the loop? In other words, so you have this, did you somehow tie in what happened afterwards to your conversations, or how did that work? You see what I'm saying? In other words, at some point then the patient goes to the doctor and they have objections or something. How did you get the feedback to iteratively improve your conversation? Does that make sense?
I see what you're saying. So I'll tell you about most of the time what would happen with patients who did move forward. I actually would have had done the financing before the evaluation. Like it was like, that's how upfront we were, as if you're here, you need treatment. And so again, a lot of they're so qualified when they come in from the book and the phone conversations. Of course, sometimes we turn them away, but they were so qualified. We talk about what treatment would look like. And we've just decided as a practice that we were just using the best premium technology. So it was like, it didn't matter if you get a mild loss or a severe loss. Our treatment plan at the time, that's gone up because of inflation, was $175 a month. And so it didn't matter what you had, you were going to get the care you needed. And so that conversation was easy for me. Where a lot of pride, it's how they want to go about practice, which is fine. They have different levels and different options. We were just like, we know this device is the best. This is what it costs with our service, the appointments, all of that. And so I'd have that conversation of like, so what are your thoughts about treatment? You've admitted to hearing loss. These are the symptoms. We can help you. Well, I need to afford it. Okay, this is our plan. This is what it looks like. And once you're ready to start, we'll start the evaluation, which is part of treatment. We don't just do tests. It's like what's part of your treatment plan. Approve them on the financing program, pass them on to the doctor, and then they're fit right after the evaluation because they agreed before the evaluation even started.
Oh, great. So they're paying it's a subscription model, it sounds like.
Yeah, it is a subscription model. Yep, exactly. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense for especially patients on fixed incomes. Like I've seen like some like research or studies out there where the average American only has $400 left over at the end of the month after all their bills are paid, right? And our subscription program fit in that. A lot of patients, another reason why they're afraid of starting is the cost, because oftentimes they think about $8,000 or $7,000, which I think the average American doesn't have, let alone someone in their 70s who's retired. And so with Social Security or proper budgeting, a lot of patients can fit 175 or 197 into their budget. So we took the subscription model approach because I think it's the right thing for the patient, and they get to hold on to their lump sum of savings and just make it part of their payment. Because insurance doesn't cover a lot of technology either. And so a lot of patients viewed our plan as their insurance for their hearing healthcare. They just made monthly payments.
Right. No, that totally makes sense. I mean, that's why people go and buy cars and ask what the monthly payment is. Not
yeah, it's the world we're in. I mean, Netflix, there's BarkBox to get monthly toys for your dog. I mean, insurance, everything is payments, and seniors can budget that, opposed to I need to now come up with $7,000, and that's a very different conversation.
Sure. And so when you're trying to, what we've covered right now are what I would call patient objections, right?
Yeah.
I suspect you also have to coach through what I would call provider objections.
Totally.
And so so these are, for the listeners, these are the objections that the people providing the care. So some of this is mindset, right? In other words, people have come in with certain preconceived notions about the delivery of this. And so what are the most common, like what are the top three things you hit on the provider side?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So at AuDExperts, we have 4 pillars of success. It's culture, mindset, science, culture, mindset, science, and marketing. And one of those pillars is mindset. And because you need the right mindset before going into things, I'm fully well aware that a lot of the stuff I'm saying, a lot of people in audiology disagree with me. You need the test results to fit them with the right technology. We're just going to have to agree to disagree. If I know a specific device that we we think is the best, and we're going to recommend it to 99% of patients. Of course, if someone needs a cochlear implant, we would, refer them. Of course, if they need a cross, sure. But most cases, I work in generalities, we have what we work with and works well. And so that's a mindset of patients deserve the best possible care. Because think about it this way, like that's the first of your like top three is patients deserve the best care. It's funny when I talk to a provider, they say I recommended this lower level of technology for this patient because of price. And I say, if price wasn't an object and your mother was in front of you, what would you recommend? Well, this other technology, this premium care. And it's like, we should be treating our patients like they're our parents or family. We would give them the best. And so that's the first mindset. Patients deserve the best technology out there and best testing and best care. Just like would your doctor come to you and say, do you want the stent that does 60% blood flow or 100% blood flow? Or do you want the diabetes medication that treats your insulin 50%? Yeah, exactly. Do you want the chemotherapy that's 30% effective or 100% effective, right? And so that's one of the first things with providers, is with enough conversation, they can get on board with that. Typically, what I find is underneath that is they're afraid of the price conversation because they have their own limiting beliefs on, I wouldn't pay $8,000 for treatment. And so that's the next thing. The next mindset thing is, are you worth it? Like, do you believe you're worth that amount of money? And that's why I love private practice, because you can give so much service and give so much value away that it is worth $8,000 or $7,000, whatever it is. So oftentimes it's the level of care, which is the surface, and underneath that is cost of, am I worth it as a provider to charge this much for giving someone one of their major senses back? The answer is yes, I think. Like, we're worth that kind of money and that service and value. If you're charging $8,000, giving them a device and being closed 3 or 4 days out of the week, that's a different conversation. But I think most private practice clinics would give everything away if they could. And so I think you're worth charging that much.
So that's the one objection. What are the other provider objections?
Yeah, great. Let's see.
Because I think they have their own belief, but they also don't believe that patients are willing to invest. And
that was the next thing is, I think, again, I talked about this a little bit about, but believing that every patient that comes to you is raising their hand saying, I have a hearing loss, they just might not be admitting up front. That's the other thing, is a lot of providers rely on the test, which tests are important. Like, we need that evaluation for the right prescription. They think once there's a loss there, patients are willing to start treatment. Though we see after we do the evaluation, I need to think about it. I need to talk to my spouse. It's not that bad yet. I'll wait a year. And so one of the other objections is, I can't even have this conversation until I have the evaluation, where I disagree of, like, they called you and said, I want a hearing test, where I'm, in my 20s, I've never thought about getting a hearing test just cause, right? That's one of the other things, is the mindset surrounding, like, when they come to you, when they call you, they have a hearing loss, and 99%, we can't be black and white. Most of the cases, they have a loss. So assume treatment from the beginning. Just have a conversation.
Well, they've also overcome some resistance. They're not admitting to you, but it wasn't like, they just, oh yeah, sure, I'm going to come. I mean, there was resistance for them to even make the appointment.
Totally. And that's why asking the right questions. And the way I view the trainings I do, I can help you with process, or asking for reviews, or the best practices for testing and things like that. Like, I can help with that. My biggest thing, or I think the biggest impact I have on people, is helping them have better conversations, because you can have the greatest value proposition, you can have the best technology, you can have the best treatment plan or care, but if you don't know how to communicate that in a way that a patient's open to, none of it matters. And so my trainings consist, like, right before our call, this podcast, I was working with practice and just role playing objections, and don't say this, say this, or say this first. Like, that, our communication can have a lot of impact, and a lot of people just get into audiology because they want to help people, which is fantastic. I'm not knocking that at all. That's, like, we need audiologists or providers who want to help people. They went to school to practice, to evaluate and treat and fit. They didn't go to school to have better conversations and talk about costs. And that's what's missing in this industry, is how to have a good conversation surrounding that, because they just don't have the training. It's nothing against the provider.
Sure. And so, it's working them through getting that value proposition to the patient. And how about in terms of, do they ever have problems where they kind of suggest it rather than recommend, you know what I mean? Like, well, if you want it, you can get it. I mean,
Yeah.
that issue.
One of my favorite phrases that we throw around is empathetic authority. Empathetic authority. If you break that down into two different words, what's empathy or being empathetic? That's more emotional, right? Being a shoulder to cry on, supporting someone if they're having a hard time. The authority has boundaries, draws lines in the sand, is a doctor, knows what they're talking about through experience, right? And again, providers and people went in for empathy of I want to help people, and they've learned the knowledge to be the authority. They just don't know how to communicate that in a way that is like, if you're just empathetic, you get walked over. If you're just an authority, you can't create relationships. So that's why we need to be an empathetic authority. I remember seeing this doctor. I had the flu or something years ago, went in, was trying to explain what was going on. He knew within 30 seconds what was going on, wrote a prescription. I got it. It helped me. But next time I was sick, I didn't want to go see him because there was no empathy and relationship.
Sure.
So providers are typically empathetic, which is fantastic. I need to help them be an authority with their communication. And so that is part of it, of not saying you can do this if you want, which yes, they can do if they want. Obviously, the choice is on the patients, but I would rather phrase that of this is something we need to do because it's going to get worse over time if you don't treat it. And that's two different closes, if you will. One's more authoritative, not cutting the crap and getting to the point, versus this like shy. Like again, my dad has hearing loss. I was on him for years. You got to do something about this, right? And there's a right way to go about it and a wrong way. That's what a lot of my trainings help people with. Providers could definitely give a strong medical recommendation. Again, if you take the cancer example, does your doctor say, yeah, you might want to consider chemotherapy, or do they say this is your best chance at survival?
Right.
So,
yeah. And so are there tools or things that you give them outside of you to help them learn that skill? Because it's a tough skill.
It is a tough skill. So, one, I've written my own book that dives into communication, but I actually refer people to another book.
All of you written books?
Huh?
You've all written books, right?
Yeah, the book. And well, that's so funny you say that, because like why do people write books? I think they're personally the best selling tool. That's why we gave patients the book. Like, I give someone my book on communication, they think this is amazing, I want more, and then they come to me for more.
Sure.
Dr. Dare writes a book on treatment and healthcare, and patients like, oh, maybe I want that, I want more. You have your Listen Up book, right? But a book I love is Asking Questions the Sandler Way, because what that does is it opens your mind on telling, not asking. You can tell someone you need treatment. I think it's more effective to say, what do you think about treatment? Because then you see where they're at, right? You have that conversation. Again, not so you know where they're at, even though it's important. It's so they're admitting it to themselves. Who's more likely to lose weight? Someone thinking about, I need to lose weight, or someone who tells their friends and family, I need to lose weight? Even if they haven't started the journey, they're one step closer than the person thinking about it, because saying something and thinking is different. Questions get patients to admit to why they want to do something, or even admit to a problem to begin with. You might be the first person they're ever telling that they have an issue with hearing loss. They have to admit that out loud to themselves before they're willing and open to having a conversation about treatment.
It's great stuff. Really great stuff. So.
Appreciate it.
And a lot of this it sounds like you've kind of developed on your own just time in terms of having these conversations.
Yes. And there's a couple things that I think would help have expedited my journey if I would have latched onto it early, that I want to share. Is I mentioned how I think running and patient conversations are very similar. If you think about a marathon, right, or a half marathon or 5K, I don't care what distance. If you say, I'm going from couch to running a marathon, do you go for one run 2 months out and then run the marathon? You probably could, but it would suck and it'd be painful. People do that. What's the more effective approach? Running 3 times a week, some strength training, make sure you eat your diet. But the key word is consistency leading up to there. It's the same thing with anything and everything you do, instruments, relationships, sports, whatever it is. Patient conversations, if we're willing to practice hobbies, why shouldn't we practice the thing we do every day, which I think is conversation? So when I say they're similar, what really helped me that I wish I would have started sooner was role playing these conversations out loud, of actually sitting down with someone and saying, you tell me it's too expensive and I'll respond to it. Right. It's too expensive. I appreciate that. Tell me more about what you mean by expensive. That means a lot of different things to different people, but saying that out loud before you're in the appointment. So you, people are afraid of the word role play. I'd rather you fail with me as a trainer than fail with the patient who needs your help to hear better. And so practicing out loud your conversations before and overcoming those objections, it's the same thing. It's one thing to think about what you should have said, but to say it out loud and get that muscle memory is really important. So role play really helped me get better once I implemented that, of how do I overcome this objection or ask better questions. The other thing is watching game film. So if you have cameras in your office, watching those appointments and seeing what you could have done differently, or phone call recordings for front office staff. I work with a lot of front office staff. Recorded lines, we listen to where they didn't acknowledge or what questions they should have asked. So those are the big things, is role play and game film. Pros watch game film. Tom Brady, love him or hate him, 6 rings. What does he do? He watches his own game film to see what he can do to get better. And so if you want to get better, why not? I mean, as a provider, I think it's something you're leaving on the table if you don't practice and if you don't watch what you do, because you'll learn a lot from that.
Yeah, I mean, professional sports, in the NFL, right? A game is about 3 hours. And they get Monday off if they play on Sunday. And then they spend Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday preparing. So they spend 5 days preparing for a 3-hour game. And then they do warm up before. So they spend several hours. So, the play versus practice concept is a little bit misappropriated, because a lot of people want to just play in the clinical arena, but they don't want to necessarily practice getting better before playing.
And I totally agree. That's one of the analogies. That's one of the other things that I guess you could say of limiting beliefs or objections when working with people, is just putting in a little extra time. Like I'll work with a lot of owners, and they'll hire me to come work with their team, and they'll ask me to start role playing and stuff like that. But initially I have to help people understand why we're practicing. Or sometimes owners want me to come work with their team, but they won't even take time off of their schedule to actually practice. And I get it. It's hard to say we need to close down the office for a day, or we need to block an hour every day. It's worth it in the long run, to your point of how much do football players practice for a 3-hour game. We should do the same thing, even if it's just 30 minutes a day. 30 minutes is better than none. Or if you're extreme like me, what I was doing, I used to drive between 2 clinics. I drive 45 minutes to one clinic to help out the doctor there on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and be at the other place. I would have my little note cards or flashcards, and I'd set it on my dash, and I'd read things out loud of, I appreciate that. How do you feel about that? Or hearing loss is progressive, or just any phrase or question I was working on. You can role play and practice with yourself. And I would do that on my drives just to get an extra 40 minutes of practice before game day.
Yeah. And so it's like going to school on the bus and doing flashcards before a test or something.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same thing. Again, it's just like getting better at anything. If you want to get better at helping patients, you need to practice those conversations. I mean, There's no other better way to get better at them.
So Reese, if people want to get your book, how do they get that?
Probably the best thing is if people connected with me on right now, just because it's a little bit new, I'm just giving copies away for free. So if someone were to reach out to me on LinkedIn, or I'm pretty active on Instagram, being a younger guy, Reese, Reesed Jones. If they sent me a message and say, hey, I listened to the podcast, I'd be happy to send them a book. It's called How to Get What You Want Out of Every Conversation. And what's really cool about where I'm at, that's exciting for my future, is yes, I've started in audiology, but I have a real estate client. I've worked with a graphic designer, CPA firms, because you need to be able to communicate wherever you're at. That's why our pillars are so great: marketing, science, culture, and keep dropping it. The marketing, science, culture, and mindset. Those are needed in whatever business or industry you're in. And so my communication strategies, I'll get on. I had this really interesting conversation with a client where we hopped on. We were going to talk about his phone calls and how it went through the last week, because I see him once a week. And I was like, so how did the week go? And he was like, I don't have a listening problem. And I was like, okay, interesting. What do you mean by that? And he was like, well, I was talking to my girlfriend and she called me out and said I wasn't listening to her. But when I repeated back every word she said, she was really shocked. And I was like, right, you don't have a listening problem. You have a problem with helping people feel listened, which is 2 different things. Helping people feel heard. And so we had this conversation of what it's like to listen and what it's like to acknowledge. Because you can listen to someone, but if they don't feel acknowledged, it doesn't matter, right? And so we had that conversation in his relationship, and it was absolutely applicable to patient care. And so communication, it's the one thing we're doing 100% of the time. Even if you're just sitting there, your body language is communicating something. And so my book is to as general as it can be, so people can implement it in whatever area of their life. Again, I started this with I want to reduce as much unnecessary suffering as possible. And I think the way we can reduce a lot of suffering is through our conversation.
Agreed. And that could be explored in multiple topics in terms of why hearing loss as an obstacle, social media is an obstacle. There's a lot of different things that get in the way. Reese, what's your favorite sound?
Favorite sound?
Yeah. We're in the sound business, right? We all listen.
Favorite sound. My favorite sound is my heavy breathing when I'm running. Like it's very like the rhythm you can get into. It's kind of like meditative. But running is like, I love the work I do. If I didn't run every day, I wouldn't be able to do the work I do. So anything related to either my footsteps pounding or like my heavy breathing, knowing I'm working, that's probably my favorite thing to listen to. That's great. And again, Reese, if people want to get a hold of you, it was on LinkedIn. Yeah, LinkedIn or Instagram. Reese Jones is my at. And what's cool about my Instagram is I post daily communication and sales tips and tricks. So if people didn't want the book, but they just wanted a reminder of say this or don't say this. Like one of the examples I'll give you that is like so simple, but can dramatically change your conversations is the word but. The word but can destroy what you're saying. So this is like one of the examples I'll do if I'm working with someone is like, let's say I'm with a team and there's, a woman sitting there and her hair's down, like she doesn't have it tied up or anything. I'll say, let's say her name's Alyssa. Alyssa, your hair looks really nice today, but it would look good if you put it up. Sounds like an insult. It sounds like I just kind of like there's a little bit of a dig. Versus if I said your hair looks really nice today and it would look good if you put it up, that simple change changes the way it comes across. So you got to remove the word but as best as you can, because a lot of patient like providers, they'll get an objection. I just don't think I'm ready to do this. I totally get that but, and then they go on to explain and it doesn't really sound like you totally get it. So I post things like that every day to just help change your conversation. So Instagram, LinkedIn's probably the best bet.
Oh, this is great. So for everybody, this is Reese Jones. He's a practice trainer at AuDExperts. Reese, this has been great. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I really think you're honing in some really important stuff in terms of treating hearing loss. And I appreciate you sharing it. Yeah, I enjoyed the conversation as well. It's my favorite thing to do. It's what I train on all the time. And so thanks for the opportunity, and I appreciate your time. Sure, this has been great.
Thanks for tuning in to the Listen Up podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get updates on future episodes.